first proposed this idea about 6 weeks ago, a small group of people from organizations, based on the fact that there had been an enormous resonance for the EcoSocialist contingent at the Keystone XL demonstration on February 17th. We thought, well, maybe there was enough interest in trying to discuss more things, both from an activist perspective and from a historical and theoretical perspective, in order to try and draw out some lessons and generalize about where we're going and where we need to go and how we got into this mess in the first place. So that was 6 weeks ago, and we were hoping that, well, we didn't even know whether it would work actually, and we were hoping for maybe 100 people and we would count that as a success, but I was just told that there were 240 people who registered today. And we have people from all over the country and other countries as well, and so this is an international gathering, and I think that this is the first step along the road towards building a genuine left wing of the climate justice movement, where we can start to influence the movement as a whole and say what we need to be talking about is some of the things that Gloria was talking about in terms of, well, how do we fight for some real reforms to this system? And I've learned tons of things already today in the various different workshops, and been really happy to be here. So both from the panelists and from the audience members, because I think obviously we have something to give, but we have a lot to learn, not just from people in this room, but from all of the movements that are going on around the world and in this country already. And I think we need to be humble and open to other ideas and ways of working together, and part of the idea of this conference was to get together all groups and organizations and publications who agreed with the eco-socialist statement that said we need to be independent of the Democrats and we need to organize independently together, and obviously the more united we are around some core concepts, the stronger we will be. Because we know that divide and conquer is the strategy of the ruling class, and the reason that they use that is because there's way more of us than there are of them. And so the more united we get, the more chance we have of getting what we want and ultimately living in a completely different world. And so I want to talk a little bit about what is our vision for an alternative world. And I want to throw out a couple of questions, one of which is, what do we mean by a good standard of living? What do we actually mean by that question? Because we know what we are told that's supposed to mean, right? The accumulation of more things, of more stuff. But what do we mean by what it means to have buen vivir, have a good life? Secondly, when are you or we happiest? When you think about your life, what actually makes you happy? Which relates to the first question. And then finally, what does it mean in the current age that we live in to be utopian? What is it to believe, have a utopian vision for the future? Because I would argue that to expect this system to solve the crisis that it manufactured is utopian. And therefore the only rational way out of this is to get rid of the system. And this slogan has resonance all across the world and originated in Copenhagen in 2009 as a way of expressing, whether you're anti-capitalist or not, you recognize, particularly since 2008 and the ongoing economic crisis, that there are deep structural fundamental problems about this economic system, which are not just destroying our own lives individually, but destroying the entire planet upon which we ultimately depend, something that evades completely the thought processes of mainstream economists. To the extent that I picked this up just the other day, wasted some money, but the National Review, I don't know whether you can all see this, the cover of the National Review, Wonderland, with the miracle of Canada's tar sands. it's not a joke. So where do you go with that? Because there's clearly the power of the oceans, the power of the tides, the power of scientific rationality is not enough to get capitalism to change course, right? In fact, you can bury one of the most iconic cities in the world under a 13-foot wall of water, and you still don't get the problem mentioned by the two people running for president in October. In other words, Hurricane Sandy does not get mentioned, climate change does not get mentioned, even though New York City is under several feet of water, people are homeless, there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no transportation system, etc., etc. But we can carry on. We can continue to extract fossil fuels, etc. And you know, the distortions that go on under capitalism are so obscene, it's hard to wrap your head around it sometimes, just on a micro level as well as a macro level. I was going on the subway today, I took a couple of trains, and I was just looking at the ads. We see about 3,000 ads a day, right, on average, the average American. And one ad was for a credit card, and so this is the slogan for the credit card: less plastic, more human. Discover it is human. Discover is the card that they were advertising. So in other words, you can actually be more human by having this type of credit card. Another ad, and this gets to the quality of life question, another ad that I passed by was about online delivery of food, how you can order online instead of having to phone somebody, right? So their ad is, you've perfected the art of getting to third base faster. Food delivery date night. Yeah. The obscenity and depravity of capitalist alienation knows no depths to which it will not plumb. And so I think that in contrast, I mean, you know, this is something that Marx talked about quite a bit. He was speaking at the anniversary of the People's Paper in 1856. He had this to say, and I think this resonates far more with us now than it even did in his time. On the one hand, there have started into life industrial and scientific forces which no epoch of the former human history had ever suspected. On the other hand, there exist symptoms of decay far surpassing the horrors recorded of the latter times of the Roman Empire. And that kind of sense of decay pervades our world as it is currently structured. He goes on, in our days, everything seems pregnant with its contrary. Machinery, gifted with the wonderful power of shortening and fructifying human labour, we behold starving and overworking it. The newfangled sources of wealth, by some strange weird spell, are turned into sources of want. The victories of art seem bought by the loss of character. At the same pace that mankind masters nature, man seems to become enslaved to other men or to his own infamy. Even the pure light of science seems unable to shine but on the dark background of ignorance. And this antagonism between modern science and industry on the one hand and social misery and dissolution on the other hand is the epoch that we're currently living through. And actually there's a debate going on, has been going on for a little while at this point in time, about have we entered a new geological epoch among scientists and geologists. This will take a while to resolve, but scientists are starting to lean towards the idea that the answer is yes. And this is a big decision for science because a geological epoch is measured in tens of thousands of years. So you have to have a way of measuring the impact of human society over not just a few hundred years, but hundreds of thousands of years. What would be our impact on that kind of scale? Because obviously civilization collapses, all the buildings disappear under sand and dirt and erosion and whatever else, and what's left? So we are currently living in the Holocene, or have been since the last ice age, and it's being argued that we are now entering a new epoch, the Anthropocene, the age of man, and because we've caused such a level of disruption to the environment. And one interesting question, an important question is, how are we going to measure where we start the Anthropocene? And geologists, scientists are congregating around the idea 1945, because that's when the atom bombs get dropped and the testing starts. And we will be able to measure the difference in the isotopic fractionation of the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years. So the most long-lived legacy of this so-called civilization might be the irradiation of the atmosphere. How despicable is that as a testament to the human race? So clearly, we have to have a real alternative, because the only people who are actually planning for climate change in this country, guess?
Pentagon.
The Pentagon. The Pentagon are actively planning for climate change, and they've got answers. Major General Mike Leonard, who's part of the Marine Corps, and he operates a few different bases. He's worked at Guantanamo, must be a nice guy. He says, a country worth defending is a country worth preserving. Environmentalists need large open space, expanses of space where endangered species can recover and thrive. The military needs large open expanses of space so they can train. What could possibly go wrong? Having a nature reserve that's also a bombing range. Of course they can coexist. Why is, and the Navy in particular is so-called about to sail the Great Green Fleet on the basis of biofueled and nuclear-powered warships. Why are they so invested in it? Because where are Navy bases? By definition on the coastline, right? They know they're going to be underwater, so they've got to take evasive action, as it were. So the Navy in particular is making sure, along with the Army, in terms of supply routes and so on, this question very, very seriously. The Navy's new slogan is, of course, a global force for good. Because they found out through some research that they were doing that trying to sign young people up to what do you want to do with your life, go and kill people in large numbers, was not a good selling point. So they changed it to a global force for good. But I think we obviously need to ask ourselves much broader questions, because just to quote from Carolyn Merchant about how they envision nature and the environment. The 20th century Garden of Eden is the enclosed shopping mall, decorated with trees, flowers and fountains, in which people can shop for nature at the Nature Company, purchase natural clothing at Esprit, sample organic foods and rainforest crunch in kitchen gardens, buy 21st century products at sharper image, and play virtual reality games in which Sim Eve is reinvented in cyberspace. The mall, enclosed by the desert of the parking lot surrounding it, is covered by glass domes reaching to heaven, accessed by spiral staircases and escalators, affording a vista over the whole garden of shops. With their engineered spaces and commodity fetishes, they epitomize consumer capitalism's vision of recovery from the fall. And so I think, quite obviously, we need a much bigger vision. And to quote James Baldwin, he had an argument in the 1950s with William Faulkner about whether they should go slow on the question and be patient on the question of civil rights. And he wrote an essay within which I'll quote from, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring, one clings to what one knew, or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreamed that one possessed. Yet, it is when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished, or a privilege he had long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams, for greater privileges." So, while we need to fight on every front available to us, we are engaged in the struggle to stop the Keystone XL pipeline, quite obviously. And actually, there have been, it's not like we haven't won some things with regard to that fight. If we hadn't already been fighting the Keystone XL in Canada and here, it would already have been approved, right? We've already delayed that decision, and the demonstration in DC was another way of delaying it further. They haven't been able to. Obama is trying to get his ducks in a row to make sure that he can sell the sellout to enough liberal organizations to get them to kind of hum and ha. And I think that's where we need to go in and have a real left wing and argue that we are going to call a demonstration immediately he approves it and organize to build it as widely as possible and march on the White House. And I think, you know, the divestment campaign, is it everything we want? Obviously not, but it's a campaign and we should join it and be involved to the fullest extent that we can. Because, as I mentioned in another workshop, and as probably people are well aware, we need to win some victories to buy ourselves some time, and we need to win some victories to gain confidence that we can win more things and build our organization, because if it's the one thing that we lack, it's the question of organization and how do we strengthen the networks in this city, between countries, to build a better future. Because you know, you can see capitalism as one way of seeing capitalism, apart from insane, is a global simplification project, right? What works best for capitalism is massive economies of scale, a huge concentration of wealth, and ever larger multinational and transnational corporations, to the extent that biodiversity is viewed as an impediment to capital accumulation. It's much better if they have monocultures, vast acres of monocultures. It's much better for capitalists if we live off essentially 4 animals, or 4 grains, or 4 fish. It's much more efficient from a capitalist perspective, and efficiency under capitalism means only the fastest accumulation of money possible, and yet that has led to, I mean, I was in the agriculture panel and learned a lot of things, and you take the question of food, and I looked up the definition of food, and this is the definition of food: any nourishing substance that is eaten, drunk, or otherwise taken into the body to sustain life, provide energy, promote growth. How many of us had food today based on that definition? Right? What they sell us is mostly poison, and they have forcibly depopulated the rural areas in this country in order to concentrate us in the urban areas and replace humans with machines, to the extent that the food that they've been selling us has become so toxic, they've invented a whole new category of food called organic food. And it's like, what the hell happened to the other stuff? Why do I have to go spend more of my money, if I can even afford it, on this organic food? There's all kinds of contradictions that we, I'm sure, know about. Or, you know, you think about consumer demand as if we are the ones making the decisions. Would we have created a system where the food is so poisonous that we have to then go and grow some other things to do that? Or you think about fast food, right? 1 in 5 meals in this country are eaten off somebody's lap because you're running somewhere else, because you've got a second job or a third job, or you're already working 12 hours in the job that you have, if you're lucky, in a certain sense. I mean, you know, I've been on lots of demonstrations in my time, but I've never been on a demonstration where the chanting was, "Feed us crap, only do it faster." Fast food would never have been invented if we're the ones who made the decisions about what should and should not have been produced. I mean, when you think about breaking bread with other human beings, it's one of the most sensuous, fulfilling experiences that you can have as a human being, right? It is jam-packed full of cultural connotation going back tens of thousands of years to the very birth of humanity 200,000 years ago in Africa. The idea that we would share food and break bread together has been eradicated, because in sitting down and enjoying a meal and taking time to do that, there is no time under capitalism. And I think that is one of the key things, one of the key insights that Marx had about where we should go from here, because the corporations, when you read some of what they're talking about, the corporations, the food corporations in particular, one of the most despicable aspects of capitalism, they realize that actually the capitalist system is so productive there aren't enough people to eat the food, even though people go hungry all the time. Not only are there a billion obese people, but there are also a billion underfed people. Some of those people are the same people, undernourished people. But the capitalist corporations fight over what they call stomach share, because they've run out of the number of stomachs for the amount of food that they produce. Therefore, what's their option if they're in this death struggle with each other? You have to increase the size of everybody's stomach. And so that is the active strategy, because it makes much more money from a capitalist point of view to do that. Lots of effort and time and engineering goes into food science to create what's called the bliss point. The bliss point is the perfect combination of salt, sugar and fat that does not allow your brain to recognize that you have eaten and that you are full, in order for you to keep eating and keep consuming. And so that is the level of sickness that we currently live in. And so what's really the alternative? Because there was a recent article in Scientific American that Mark Jacobson, he's a professor at Stanford, people may have seen his 2009 study that said by 2030 we could have the whole world powered by wind, water and solar power. He's come up with a new plan for New York State for how we could do that, the same thing, by 2030. We would be reducing our energy consumption by 37% because it's more efficient to use renewables than fossil fuels. There'd be 4,000 less mortalities in New York State a year because we wouldn't be breathing the stuff that we're currently breathing. There would be more people at work, and we would save $33 billion a year. And what does he say about what are the main, he was asked in a recent interview, what are the main obstacles to achieving this? He said, the main obstacles, and he says, I'm not an advocate, I'm a scientist, this is what I do. But he said the main obstacles are political and social, getting politicians on board. There are always local zoning issues. I'm sure there will be a big push by the gas lobby and the oil lobby against this. If society is going to do it, at least we know it's technically and economically feasible. Whether it actually happens depends on the political will. And so, I don't know whether people saw, there was a recent article in Time magazine where the article was titled The Revenge of Marx, because they keep announcing him dead, and somehow he keeps magically coming back. And actually the article starts off, and this is in the business world finance section of Time, Karl Marx was supposed to be dead and buried. And that's how it begins. But then it goes on. From the floor of the US Congress to the streets of Athens to the assembly lines of southern China, political and economic events are being shaped by escalating tensions between capital and labor to a degree unseen since the communist revolutions of the 20th century. How this struggle plays out will influence the direction of global economic policy, the future of the welfare state, political stability in China, and who governs, from Washington to Rome. And yes, that's Time magazine a couple of weeks ago. So they quote a couple of different Chinese workers, one who says, the way the rich get money is through exploiting the workers. Communism is what we are looking forward to. Another worker, this is also in Time magazine, another worker says, workers will organize more. All the workers should be united. So in a small sense, this conference is, there's clearly a new mood in the world, and I think we're heading into a new period. We have really been since 2011 with the Arab Spring and Wisconsin and Occupy and all the things that we've been fighting for, in particular since 2009. But there's clearly a new era that we're entering into, which is an era of revolt, rebellion, and revolution. And so what is it that we really want to kind of fight for. And I think one of the key things is, because going back to that study that I quoted on how New York State could be wind, water and solar powered in 20 years' time, he says that, and he doesn't imagine, he takes everything that currently exists, that it will still exist, and he still thinks it's possible. In other words, the transportation will still remain based on private transportation, not public transportation. We won't be taking any other measures. We'll be just changing one form of supplying energy for a less polluting form of supplying energy. And yet, I think obviously we need a much, much bigger vision, because as one of the speakers in the food panel mentioned, what it means to put wind turbines in Mexico is an increase in poverty, because they kick people off the land in order to put the wind turbines in. So we have to talk about, it shouldn't be too surprising, that we're not just talking about changing energy systems, we're talking about changing the social and political power in this country and around the world. And we're not going to get positive ecological change without some positive social change, which means putting front and center questions of fighting racism, fighting sexism, and fighting homophobia, along with rearranging the social and political policies, because the pendulum of power has swung so far to one side that we need to urgently form a movement to pull it back and ultimately get rid of the entire pendulum, if that analogy really works. In terms of lack of time, Marx had quite a lot to say about this, and something else that Joel mentioned about the concept of ownership. The concept of yours versus mine is one of the most distorting and alienating concepts that we currently have to live with. The possession and ownership of things, and how we see our basic human fulfillment through the prism of ownership of things. And I can feel more fulfilled if I can only buy more stuff and get the next generation of iPhone or whatever it is. And I will be feeling more human than I did before, once I've acquired this. Of course, if you have the ability to do that, you very quickly find yourself unfulfilled, empty, and as J.K. Galbraith said, really capitalism is the production of manufactured discontent. We are continually unhappy in our distorted lives, and we obviously have no idea what it means to be fully human in any real sense. When you think about what was one of the first things, this is really a 10,000 year struggle that we're at the culmination of, to privatize the entire planet. That's really what it's about. In fact, to the extent that they've now managed to privatize even words. McDonald's has a patent, i.e. ownership, on 114 different words and phrases in the English language. If you think about patenting genes and all the rest of it, the ownership started actually, what was one of the first things they privatized 10,000 years or so ago, at the beginning of civilization, class society, was the female body. Became privatized. So how do we go back and via revolution open up such questions of sexuality, gender, in our relationship to each other and our relationship to nature? Because these are questions, I think, the very large questions that we need to address in terms of very, very simple things. What we really are talking about is changing our relationship to each other and the planet. Right? We're not talking about a relationship to things, which is deeply alienating. We're talking about a relationship to each other and the planet. And how do we form a movement that would be for those things? So, for example, it's not just a question of energy, it's not just a question of public ownership or public transportation, although we want all those things. It's a question of what Marx talked about, overcoming the metabolic rift, where we're completely separated off from nature. In fact, there are three real separations, because capitalism has put animals in one place, crops and plants in another, humans is somewhere else, and then created this insanely energy-intensive, water-intensive, polluting system, which is entirely linear. Waste comes out at every point. And as far as the capitalists are concerned, that doesn't really matter. But do we really need to own anything? And I think this is, some of the limitations of talking about how do we change our consumption patterns? Because it's clearly not about changing just our consumption. And actually, if we see ourselves as just buying different things, then we have actually fallen into the trap laid by capitalism, because we start to see ourselves as consumers as opposed to producers, as opposed to valuable human beings in and of our own right. And there's a whole number of books that you can buy. But I was just in the bookshop recently, and there's a new book, Raising Baby Green, The Earth-Friendly Guide to Pregnancy, Childbirth and Baby Care. Apparently the book is at the forefront of the green baby movement. So you can totally have a green baby under capitalism. Or there's a book out last year, EcoSex, Go Between the Sheets and Make Your Love Life Sustainable, by Stephanie Weiss. I'll just quote from the publicity below, because I think it kind of goes to the insanity that is this system. They take people's good intentions to try and do something, and thanks very much, and turn it into another buying opportunity for the system. Leaving a smaller carbon footprint in the bedroom is easy with EcoSex, a green sex guide that will inspire both sexual and ecological excitement. Renew your passion for the environment while you recharge your love life. Yep, nothing like thinking about offsetting your carbon credits to get you a little hot under the collar. With green sex toys, low-impact lingerie, fair trade biodegradable condoms, bamboo bed linens, hand-cranked vibrators, conflict-free diamonds, and much more. So, yeah, I'd be the first to admit that I may not be as experienced as perhaps I should be with vibrators. However, the concept of a hand-cranked vibrator does seem to be something of a contradiction in terms. Yes, but maybe that's just my inexperience shining through. Moving along to perhaps more serious issues. When you think about the idea of not owning stuff, I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a library, right? And on the small scale, what is a library? Well, you get to borrow books that you don't own, read things that you're interested in, and then give it back to the library and so that somebody else can do it, right? Radical concept. When was the last time you heard somebody complain about libraries? Right? Goddamn libraries. They're everywhere.
They're selling them off in New York, though.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's another thing that we have to fight for, right? But the idea that you have to own your own individual washing machine, dryer, any number of other things, they could all be socialized, and as Joel was saying, held in common. Because really the future is about holding things together in common and producing things for what we need, not for what makes money. In fact, expanding on that, we don't even need money. You don't actually need money, right? In a society based on cooperation and real democracy, and producing things that you need, then you can cooperate and coordinate in order to exchange those things without the need for money, without the constant expansion that is inherent to capitalism. How can we just make the things that we need so that everybody is satisfied, and we're not working every God-given hour in order to do so? We're actually reversing the equation that is capitalism, replacing people with machines, and thinking about how we can have a much more meaningful way of living by working a lot less. So that why do you need lines on maps called countries, right? Ultimately, why aren't we living in a world that there are no nation states? In fact, there are no states as such. Why can't we organize cooperatively and collectively to solve the problems that are bequeathed to us by capitalism and move forward in a way that is truly human and worthy of the kind of immense, amazing cultural things that we've managed to do, even under capitalism or under feudalism and other forms of class society. How can we take the deep ecological insights of indigenous cultures around the world and connect those to some of the technological know-how that we've accumulated at the same time, and take the best from both worlds in order to make sure that we can have ecological farming that is human scale, that is putting our species and other species at the forefront of everything that we do. And this was a concept that Martin Luther King Jr. was coming to towards the end of his life, having won political rights. The next question for him was, what about economic rights? When are we going to, because the right to vote obviously is important, and people died just to get the right to vote. But once we've won the right to vote, where do we go from there? And this is what he said in 1967, and that's the title of his speech, Where Do We Go From Here? We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, now that's 50 million, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? And Marx talked a lot about how ownership distorts us. He also talked a lot about time, and how one of the major aspects of living in a truly human society that's based on cooperation, real democracy, and production for need is the immense amounts of time we'd have to develop ourselves spiritually, intellectually, culturally, do all kinds of other things. And actually the word spirit from the Latin just means to breathe. And so if we are going to really breathe on this planet, we are going to need every kind of awakening possible in order to fight for a movement, because there's no sense in which they're going to turn around, right? The 1%, warfare is endemic to capitalism, racism is endemic to capitalism, so is sexism. If we're going to live in a completely different world without those things, we need to get rid of capitalism. We need to fight for reforms right now, but we also need a vision of a completely different world where we're living in equality and freedom, and we have the time and the energy to replant our crops, rethink how we live, reimagine what food is, and our relationships, not in terms of the things that we can accumulate, but in the ways in which we can accumulate friends, relationships, and investigate nature. Because capitalism, and I'll finish on this, capitalism posits that there is a fundamental separation between humans and the environment. That's why they use the word environment, really, because it says the environment is somewhere else and we are humans. Whereas if you talk about ecology and you talk about what humans really are, well, we're as much part of nature as anything else is. Our ability to investigate and find things out shouldn't be just based on the fact, as it primarily is under capitalism, what can we use it for? What is it good for? How much money can I make from it? But purely for the sense of serene beauty that we get from knowing the universe better, because by knowing the universe and nature better, we actually know ourselves better. That is the dialectics of nature. And to follow on from Epicurus, the kind of age that the epoch that I would like to go into is the Oikotocene, which doesn't sound too sexy, and it's a little difficult to pronounce. However, that is the age of conformity to nature. And that is the age that I think we urgently need to fight for. So I'm very, very happy to be part of a movement that is growing, that there is an emerging left wing as part of it. And I think we can go on to win some victories and slow down the capitalist death train that is leading us over the carbon cliff, ultimately derail it, and get rid of the idea that we need to be hurtling towards oblivion at a faster and faster pace, accumulating more and more stuff, and then start to find out years and generations post-revolution, how we can reorganize and live as fully human beings in a world that we are not exterminating, but seen as beneficiaries of, and as bona patri familias, as tenders of the household for, as Marx called it, future generations. And I think that that is the kind of vision that we need in order to go forward. Thanks very much.